The first-class carriage door closed, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Every eye turned toward seat 1A, where a middle-aged black man sat motionless. In his hand gleamed a Patek Philippe watch, the cold steel catching the light in a way that made Laura, the 28-year-old flight attendant, feel her heart race. She had just shouted through the intercom, "He refuses to leave his seat. I need a manager immediately." No one in the carriage could believe what was happening. A man in a dark suit, dignified in appearance, yet suspected of fraud in the very seat he had purchased. His name was Jonathan Harris, 45 years old. But to Laura and a few other passengers in that moment, he was merely a black stranger in the wrong place. Jonathan did not resist. He did not argue. He simply sat still, calm, his eyes looking straight ahead, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His silence was so unnerving it frightened people more than if he had shouted. Laura felt her throat tighten but forced her voice to stay firm. "You're holding up the entire train. If you can't prove it, you will be removed." Dozens of phones were raised. Cameras pointed straight at Jonathan. A young passenger whispered, "This clip is going viral." But Jonathan only smiled faintly, not loud, not boastful, just enough to send a chill through Laura and those around him. It was the smile of a man who already knew how this would end. His phone buzzed with a message from someone labeled "Legal Team." "Everything is ready, just give the signal." Richard Collins, 52 years old, the train manager, appeared. He had 25 years of experience dealing with disruptive passengers, and his unshakable rule was clear: remove the problem immediately. He stepped forward, his voice heavy. "What seems to be the issue here?" Laura pointed and said, "This man is occupying seat 1A and refuses to show valid proof. I believe his ticket is fake." Richard bent down to take the ticket from Jonathan. He studied it carefully. "New York to Washington, seat 1A, every detail in order." "Valid ticket," Richard said, each word clipped. Laura froze, but quickly muttered just loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Look closely. Does he look like someone who belongs in first class?" The atmosphere turned to stone. A young woman was live-streaming the scene, viewers jumping from 8,000 to 20,000. Comments poured in. "Did she really just say that? This is blatant discrimination." Jonathan turned, speaking for the first time. His voice was deep, steady, each word etched into the air. "Are you saying someone like me doesn't have the right to sit here?" The question struck like a hammer through the carriage. Richard faltered. Laura flushed, but stubbornly replied, "Maybe you used points or some trick. This seat is $1,200. I don't believe you could afford it." Jonathan's face remained unchanged. His answer was sharp, precise. "I paid in full at 6:43 this morning." The cold accuracy of his words made Richard's spine tingle. Most people could not recall such detail, unless they had prepared for this moment. Murmurs spread across the carriage. A businessman in seat 2C whispered, "We're being delayed over this nonsense." Richard exhaled, weighing his decision. "If you refuse to move, I'll have to call station security." "No," Jonathan replied, plain and final. One word, yet sharp as a blade. Richard froze. In 25 years, he had heard shouting, anger, defiance, but this no was different. It wasn't fueled by rage, but by certainty. Jonathan lifted his gaze and locked eyes with Richard. "Before you do that, let me ask you, are you familiar with Federal Regulation 49 CFR 219.11? Richard went pale. That was the clause defining the rights and limits of railway staff during operations. How could an ordinary passenger know such detail? The carriage erupted in noise. The live stream counter jumped to 50,000 viewers. Comments flooded in. Is he a lawyer? They're in serious trouble now. Laura began to panic. He's threatening us. I'm calling security right now. But Jonathan only glanced at his watch, the steel glint catching the light. In 15 seconds, your radio will buzz, and then everything will change. Richard stiffened. Which radio? And then, as if on cue, his radio crackled to life. A frantic voice from the operations center barked, "Richard, stop immediately. Do not touch the passenger in seat 1A. Social media is blowing up. 60,000 people are watching live." The entire carriage went silent. Laura's face drained of color. Richard gripped the radio, his heart pounding. Jonathan's lips curved into the faintest smile. Right on time. The static from the radio faded, and the first-class carriage fell into a state of half panic, half curiosity. Phones remained raised. Dozens of cameras fixed on Jonathan Harris, as though he were the defendant in a public trial. Richard Collins tried to steady his voice, but sweat had already formed on his forehead. "Sir, who are you really?" Jonathan slowly set his watch on the small table beside his seat and lifted his face. "I am simply a passenger, and more importantly, I am a paying customer sitting exactly where I belong." The reply was simple, but his gaze cut sharp as a blade, leaving Richard speechless. Laura, unable to restrain herself, burst out, "Don't believe him. A man like him could never." She left the sentence hanging, but everyone understood its meaning. A middle-aged white man in seat 2C clicked his tongue and shook his head. Meanwhile, Emily's live stream climbed to 75,000 viewers, with comments exploding. "Did the flight attendant just imply what I think she did? This is disgraceful. What year is this? He knows the law. He's no ordinary passenger." Jonathan turned his wrist, unzipped the leather bag at his feet. Richard instinctively stepped back, fearing he might pull out something dangerous, but all that appeared was a polished black wallet. Jonathan set it on the table and opened it. Inside was a metal card engraved with gleaming letters. The steel reflected under the carriage lights, forcing eyes to squint. Emily zoomed in close, broadcasting the words for all to see. "Jonathan Harris, Chairman of the Board, United Railways." The carriage fell silent. Laura staggered back, her hand covering her mouth. Richard froze, stammering, You are." Jonathan replied evenly, "Yes, I am not just a passenger. I am part of the board that decides the fate of this entire railway system. And just now, you showed the world your true face." Murmurs erupted. A businesswoman whispered from the back row, "My God, the chairman himself is here." A college student shouted into his stream, "This is history. They just insulted their own boss." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Years of crisis management experience could not prepare him for this raw humiliation. Laura began to sob, "I didn't know. I had no idea who you were." Jonathan turned to her, his eyes not angry but heavy with cold disappointment. "The problem is not that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you assumed I didn't belong simply because I didn't look like the customers you are used to serving." His words pierced like a blade straight into Laura's heart. Richard's phone rang again. He answered reluctantly, his voice trembling. "Hello." On the other end, the firm, commanding tone of Executive Vice President Thomas Grant, 60 years old, cut through. "Richard, from this moment, no one touches Mr. Harris. Not a word, not a gesture. Every camera is streaming live to headquarters. One more mistake and your career ends immediately." Richard stood frozen, his hand shaking. He looked up and met Jonathan's eyes, calm and resolute. needing no further words. Jonathan rose to his feet. Every gaze followed him. He did not shout. He did not rage. He simply straightened his suit jacket and let his voice carry clearly across the carriage. As you have witnessed, in just 10 short minutes, an ordinary passenger can be doubted, accused, and pushed out of the seat he rightfully paid for, all because of prejudice. But today, the truth has been laid bare, and I promise none of you will ever have to endure this again. Applause broke out from a few passengers in the back, then spread through the carriage. Emily sobbed as she filmed, whispering, "He's not just a chairman. He's a symbol." Laura collapsed into her seat, her face buried in her hands. Richard slumped down, his heart racing, knowing his career might be shattered by this fateful morning. Jonathan turned toward the window. The tracks blurred past in the early light, but to him they were more than scenery. They were a reminder that this train, today, carried a truth America could no longer ignore. He murmured softly, only to himself, "Just one moment," and prejudice was unmasked. The clatter of metal echoed from the back of the carriage as 2 station security officers appeared, clad in dark blue uniforms with handcuffs dangling from their belts. Their eyes were cold, their steps deliberate. A wave of tension swept through first class, making many passengers swallow hard as their hearts raced. "Mr. Harris," Richard stammered, his voice hoarse. I think they just want procedure." Jonathan turned his head, his gaze steady. "Procedure or abuse of power that has become routine?" The 2 officers advanced. The taller one, Rodriguez, 38, rested his hand on the cuffs. The other, Kim, 32, scanned the carriage before stopping her eyes on Jonathan. Neither of them realized that every raised phone was turning this moment into live evidence broadcast to tens of thousands outside. Laura jumped up, her voice shrill. "He's the one causing trouble. He's the one delaying us." But Jonathan only looked straight ahead, unwavering. He lifted his head, his deep voice carrying clearly. "I am sitting in the seat I purchased. I am not shouting. I am not resisting. On what grounds do you plan to arrest me?" Rodriguez arched a brow and replied bluntly, "Obstructing transport operations. Federal regulations allow us to escort you out." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his eyes glinting like steel. "Do you know the consequences of unlawful detention?" The carriage fell silent. The question was not merely a challenge. It rang out as a warning. Kim faltered, her eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. Rodriguez pressed on, his tone harsh, clinging to authority. "Are you threatening us?" Jonathan spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "No. I am reminding you of the law, and reminding you that 12 cameras are recording this very moment." Emily, the young woman live streaming, raised her phone higher and shouted, 92,000 people are watching live. Don't forget that." The truth struck like lightning. Rodriguez hesitated, his stance faltering. Kim glanced at Richard, her eyes uncertain. Laura, pale and trembling, whispered, "My God, everyone has seen it all." Jonathan rose. His presence radiated no aggression, only an undeniable authority. He calmly adjusted his jacket and fixed his gaze on Rodriguez. "You have worked 8 years in this field, haven't you? How many times have you handcuffed white passengers simply for sitting quietly in their assigned seats?" Rodriguez froze. He opened his mouth, but no number came. His silence thundered louder than any confession. Jonathan turned to Kim. "And you? Do you recall a time when a blonde woman in an elegant dress was told she did not belong in first class?" Kim lowered her head. The entire carriage was swallowed by silence. Richard's phone rang again. He answered with shaking hands, then drew in a sharp breath. The voice on the other end was heavy as a hammer. "This is United Railways headquarters. No one touches Mr. Harris. That is an order." Every eye turned to Jonathan. He stood tall, his gaze sweeping across the carriage. "Do you see? In only a few minutes, the truth has been exposed. A man suspected, humiliated, not for his actions, but for prejudice. And today, that truth is no longer hidden. It has been witnessed by the entire nation." Applause broke out. Hesitant at first, then swelling into thunder. Passengers rose to their feet in unison, clapping, cheering. The live stream echoed with chants. "Justice! Don't let him stand alone." Laura collapsed into her seat, tears streaming down her face. Richard slumped, as though his shoulders had broken under the weight of truth. Rodriguez stepped back, his hand slipping away from the cuffs. Kim exhaled deeply, as if freed from an invisible burden. Jonathan lowered his voice, but each word rang with iron. "Today, you have not just witnessed an incident on a train. You have seen the true face of prejudice. But I promise, it will no longer have a place in United Railways." He sat back down in seat 1A, composed, as if untouched by the storm. Yet in his eyes burned the fire of change. And the carriage, the nation itself, stood as witness to that very moment. The applause still thundered, but Jonathan Harris raised his hand, and at once the first-class carriage sank back into silence. The air grew heavy, as though everyone was waiting for a verdict to be pronounced. He rose to his feet, tall and commanding, his shoulders straight, his eyes burning like a torch in the crowded carriage. Jonathan slowly turned his gaze across each face, passengers trembling with phones in their hands, Manager Richard staring at the floor, Laura burying her face in tears, the two security officers frozen in place. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan's voice was deep and steady, yet carried power. "We have just witnessed a bitter truth. A man sat quietly in his own seat, yet he was treated as a fraud, branded as a threat, only because his appearance did not match someone's expectations." Each word struck like a hammer. He paused, turning to Laura. She lifted her head, eyes swollen with tears, her entire body shaking. "Miss Laura," Jonathan said, his voice cold but measured. "What did you say? He doesn't look like first class. Is that the new policy of United Railways?" Laura sobbed, shaking her head. No, I only..." "Only what?" Jonathan cut in, his eyes piercing. "Only spoke what you believed? Only judged a man by the color of his skin and a suit less polished than what you are used to seeing?" The carriage was silent. Not a single passenger dared breathe. Jonathan shifted his gaze to Richard. The veteran manager lifted his face, sweat glistening on his brow. "Mr. Collins, do you remember what you said before calling security? That it was procedure. But what is the truth? You never asked further. You never verified the ticket. You simply listened to one employee and rushed to assume I was a threat." Richard swallowed hard, his voice rough. "I was wrong. I didn't realize." Jonathan's voice cut firm. "Didn't realize or didn't want to. In 25 years on the rails, how many times have you done this to people like me? How many times have you looked at skin before you reached a conclusion?" Richard fell silent, his eyes dropping. Jonathan stepped into the aisle, where every camera was fixed on him. He pulled a tablet from his case and lit up the screen. Charts, numbers, and reports glowed in the light. "To all of you watching live," he said, his voice ringing like iron, "record this. These are the statistics from the last 3 months. 46 complaints of discrimination at United Railways. 46! And this morning we have just witnessed the 47th, right here in this carriage. A gasp rippled through the passengers. Emily, the young woman streaming, whispered with trembling lips, "He brought the data. This isn't chance. This is a test." Jonathan nodded, his eyes flashing. "Exactly. I did not sit here by accident. This was an examination, and unfortunately, some of you failed miserably." He turned to the camera, his voice warm but pounding like a gavel. "There are no more excuses. Everything has been recorded, shared, and will stand as proof of the change we are now compelled to make." Laura sobbed. "Please forgive me. I will lose my job." Jonathan studied her for a long moment. In his eyes, there was no longer anger, only cold disappointment. "You will have to answer, not to me, but to every passenger here, to the hundreds of thousands watching outside. Forgiveness or not, that is no longer my choice. It is society's judgment." Laura collapsed into her seat, crying uncontrollably. Richard stood rigid, his face pale. Jonathan lifted his gaze back to the passengers. His voice lowered, but its weight was crushing. "Today, I am not only a chairman. I am the voice of everyone who has ever been pushed out of their rightful place because of prejudice. I want you all to remember, no ticket is printed with the word white or black. It carries only one thing: the right to sit." His declaration reverberated through the carriage, flowing beyond the live stream, spreading everywhere. As Jonathan returned to seat 1A, his eyes drifted toward the window. The tracks blurred past like the heartbeat of the nation. But he knew this train had already shifted to another journey, the journey of truth. The grinding of steel wheels against the tracks created a tense rhythm. In the first-class carriage, the air was thick, like a makeshift courtroom. Jonathan Harris stood once more, his eyes blazing like headlights piercing every corner of truth. He placed his hand on the back of a seat, his voice firm and resonant. "We will not wait for headquarters. This train is the headquarters. And here, right now, everything will be made clear." The carriage shook with unease. Passengers straightened in their seats, many lifting their phones closer, afraid to miss a moment. Emily whispered into her live stream, "He's turning the entire carriage into a public trial." Jonathan pointed at Laura, his tone cutting cold. "You said I don't look like first class. I ask you, what does first class look like? White skin, an expensive suit? Or simply anyone who is not me?" Laura trembled, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't mean to. I just—" "You only spoke what was in your heart," Jonathan interrupted, his words falling like a gavel. "And the entire nation heard you. The question is, do you have the courage to admit your fault before everyone?" Laura collapsed, her small shoulders trembling violently, her sobs the only answer. Jonathan turned to Richard. "Mr. Collins, 25 years as a manager. You just said you didn't realize. Yet the statistics in my hands are clear. 46 discrimination complaints in the last 3 months, most of them aimed at passengers of color. So did you not realize? Or did you choose to look away?" Richard stammered, his voice breaking. I was wrong. I trusted prejudice. I have no excuse." Jonathan nodded slightly, but his eyes remained cold. "No excuse, but there are consequences, and those consequences will no longer stay hidden." He turned to the 2 security officers. Rodriguez stood rigid. Kim lowered her eyes to the floor. "You were called here to arrest me, but I ask you, what crime have I committed?" Rodriguez tried to steady his voice. "Obstructing transport operations." Jonathan tilted his head, each word heavy with steel. Obstructing by sitting quietly in my own seat? Rodriguez swallowed hard, unable to reply. Kim spoke up, softly but clearly. No, he did nothing wrong. The carriage filled with murmurs. Many passengers nodded in agreement. Emily's live stream surged past 120,000 viewers. Comments flooded in. History is happening. He's turned them into witnesses. This is no longer an incident. This is a revolution on the rails. Jonathan set his tablet on the table, its screen glowing for all to see. In bold letters it read, Railway Discrimination Class Action Report, Draft. This, he said, his voice booming like thunder, is the report my legal team has prepared. Every passenger here today is a witness. The entire world is a witness. We are no longer speaking of a minor incident. We are speaking of systemic change. His eyes swept the carriage, locking onto each gaze. Those who agree the truth must be revealed, raise your hands. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then a frail hand rose, trembling, from an elderly woman in seat 3D. Next, a young businessman. Then the whole carriage, arms lifted in unison, a forest of silent, powerful votes. Jonathan nodded slightly. A fleeting smile touched his lips, though his eyes still burned with fire. Then it is settled. This is not only my struggle. This is the voice of all of us. Laura crumpled into her seat, sobbing. Richard bowed his head, his hand clenched tight, sweat dripping down his face. Rodriguez lowered his arms, and Kim gave a small nod, as if finally admitting the truth long denied. Jonathan returned to seat 1A, his deep voice echoing one final time. Today, no seat is too small to change an entire system, and no prejudice can halt a train called justice. Applause erupted, powerful, relentless, like crashing waves. The carriage was no longer first class. It had become a symbol. The echo of applause still lingered in the first-class carriage when Richard's emergency phone rang once more. He glanced at Jonathan, then reluctantly answered. His face turned pale, his voice trembling. Yes, I understand. Yes, everything is being live-streamed. I will hand the phone over right away. He extended the phone toward Jonathan, his hands shaking as though he held an explosive device. Jonathan slowly took it and raised it to his ear. On the other end came a deep male voice, thick with authority. Mr. Harris, this is Charles Whitmore, CEO of United Railways. We are watching live. The situation has spread nationwide. CNN, Fox, even the BBC are rebroadcasting. At this moment, at least 12 television trucks are waiting outside Union Station in Washington. What do you want us to do? The carriage fell silent. Every passenger held their breath. Laura broke into louder sobs. Richard bowed his head, drained of spirit. Jonathan's lips curved faintly, his eyes flashing. It is not about what I want. It is about what justice demands. He switched to speakerphone. Everyone in the carriage could hear the CEO's shaky voice. We will deal with the staff involved. Suspend them immediately. But, sir, I beg you, give us a chance. Do not turn this into a death sentence for the company. Jonathan stepped into the aisle, his eyes sweeping over the passengers. Every camera followed him. Emily's live stream counter surged past 180,000 viewers. Mr. Whitmore, Jonathan said, his deep voice ringing clear. You have seen what has happened. This is no longer the problem of one man. It is proof of a systemic disease. If United Railways wants to survive, we must change, here and now. Murmurs erupted across the carriage. An older passenger shook his head and sighed. I have taken trains for 30 years. I have never seen anything like this. Jonathan pressed on, each word striking like a hammer. I demand 3 things. First, immediate suspension of all staff involved. Second, a public declaration of a zero-tolerance policy against discrimination. Third, within 30 minutes, a nationwide press release announcing that United Railways will commit $10 million to an anti-bias training fund. Silence lingered on the line for a few seconds. Then the CEO sighed. We will comply, immediately. Cheers erupted from some passengers. Emily shouted, He just forced the entire company to bow before the cameras. Jonathan ended the call and placed the phone back into Richard's hand. He turned to face the carriage. You have just witnessed a truth. It was not my power that forced United Railways to change, but your cameras. It was your witness that turned prejudice into evidence, silence into a voice. Applause roared, passengers rising from their seats. A young mother clutched her child, tears streaming as she whispered, Thank you for standing up. In the corner, Laura wept, pleading, Please, I could lose everything. I still have my parents, my family. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. His eyes no longer burned with anger, but with quiet disappointment. You sowed, now you must reap. But if you are truly remorseful, a chance to make amends will come. Not from me, but from your willingness to face millions out there. Laura lowered her head, her trembling hands clutching a tissue. A sharp ding rang from Emily's phone. She gasped, Oh my God, justice. On the Rails is trending #1 on Twitter, over 300,000 tweets in less than an hour. The carriage erupted. Passengers spoke in excited tones, pointing their phones at one another, sharing the moment. Jonathan stood still at the center, his eyes distant as he gazed through the window. The endless tracks stretched out like a reminder. The path of change had opened, and there was no turning back. In Jonathan's mind echoed a single thought. This is only the beginning. I have not just exposed one incident. I have laid the foundation for a revolution. He clenched the watch on his wrist. The second hand ticked on, counting down to the moment when the company and the nation itself would have to face the truth. The carriage doors swung open, and the blinding light of hundreds of cameras instantly swept inside. Shouts, voices calling names, and the crack of flashbulbs exploded in unison, turning Union Station's platform into a media storm. Jonathan Harris stepped out first. Tall, composed, with a steady gaze, he needed no microphone and no stage. With each deliberate step, he made the crowd part like waves before the tide. Mr. Harris, were you discriminated against on this train? Will you sue United Railways? What message do you want to send to America? Dozens of questions were hurled at once. Jonathan stopped at the platform steps, raised one hand, and as if by command, the noise fell quiet, and every lens locked onto him. His voice rang out, each word echoing against the concrete walls and spreading across the station. Today, you did not only witness a passenger being humiliated, you witnessed how prejudice can stop an entire train and shake an entire company. The crowd stirred. Jonathan turned and pointed back toward the first-class carriage. Inside, one employee said outright that I did not look like first class. A manager rushed to believe it, and 2 security officers nearly cuffed me because they assumed I did not belong in the seat I paid for. Cameras swiveled toward Laura and Richard as they followed Jonathan out. Laura hung her head, mascara streaking her face, her shoulders trembling. Richard walked heavily, his head bowed like a man carrying a sentence. Shouts erupted from the crowd. Shame! Fire them! Jonathan raised his hand, stopping the wave of fury. Do not just pour your anger onto a few individuals. Yes, they were wrong, but the fault is not only theirs. The fault lies in a system that allowed prejudice to become routine. And today, before this nation, I declare, that routine ends here. Applause roared as banners rose high. Justice on the rails. A reporter pushed forward. Mr. Harris, what exactly will United Railways do? Jonathan lifted his tablet high, the screen displaying an official document. At this very moment, the CEO and board have agreed to my demands. United Railways will announce a zero-tolerance policy against discrimination. We will invest $10 million in a training and oversight fund. And this, he turned the screen toward the cameras, is the press release that will be issued within 15 minutes. The crowd erupted with cheers. Journalists rushed to capture screenshots, live streaming every detail. Emily, now a famous witness, sobbed, "My God, he actually did it." Jonathan turned back, fixing his eyes on Laura and Richard. His voice lowered, sharp and unyielding. "They will answer, not only to me, but to all of you." Laura trembled, her lips quivering. At last, she broke down, hands clasped together. "I was wrong. I apologize before everyone. I have nothing else to say." Richard lowered his head, his voice choked. "I was blind. I let prejudice guide me, and today I face the consequences." Cameras captured every tear, every sob. No one in the crowd doubted the truth anymore. Jonathan turned to a reporter's microphone, his voice booming. "But remember, my goal is not to destroy them. My goal is to change I. From this day on, every passenger, regardless of color, religion, or status, deserves to sit in the seat they paid for. No one has the right to judge a human being with just a glance." The crowd roared, voices chanting, "Justice! Justice!" until the station shook with sound. In that moment, Jonathan knew he had transformed a personal incident into the declaration of a movement. And as the flashes lit his face, history itself was stamped onto the floor of Union Station. Just hours after Jonathan Harris left Union Station, America erupted. Every news network replayed the image of him standing on the platform, raising his tablet and declaring the zero-tolerance policy. The hashtag Justice on the Rails surged to the top worldwide, surpassing 1.5 million mentions in a single evening. In the CNN newsroom, an editor whispered, "We have just witnessed the beginning of a transportation reform movement. This is no longer about one train." At the White House, the press secretary was bombarded with questions. A Politico reporter shouted, "Will the administration comment on the United Railways incident?" The reply was cautious. "The president has been briefed. This is a serious matter, one that concerns civil rights." Meanwhile, at United Railways headquarters, CEO Charles Whitmore convened an emergency meeting with the board. Faces were tense, beads of sweat glistening under the fluorescent lights. One vice president stammered, "The stock just dropped 8% in a single day. If this isn't contained, we will lose billions." Whitmore lowered his head and admitted, "Mr. Harris has forced us to confront the truth. There is no choice but to carry out every one of his demands." At the same time, live broadcasts captured the scene outside Union Station. Hundreds had gathered, holding banners aloft. Not only United Railways customers, but students, lawyers, even families with young children. Their chants thundered, "Dignity for all passengers! No seat for prejudice!" Emily, the young woman who live-streamed the incident, now stood as a key witness. Sitting in NBC's studio, her eyes red but her voice steady, she said, "I started recording thinking it was just a small incident. But when Laura said, "He doesn't look like first class," I knew I had to keep filming. Today, millions have seen what so many people of color endure in silence. Viewers applauded loudly. Jonathan sat quietly in his Washington office, gazing out at the city lights. His phone rang without pause. Interview requests, invitations to speak before Congress, messages from civil rights groups like the NAACP and ACLU. His aide handed him a folder. "Mr. Harris, 3 senators have just proposed summoning you to testify before the Transportation Committee. They want to hear directly from you." Jonathan was silent for a moment, then nodded. "All right. If we want change, then it must begin with the law." Meanwhile, Richard and Laura were surrounded by reporters. Laura wept until no tears were left, her voice breaking. "I was wrong. I let prejudice blind me. Please, give me a chance to make it right." A journalist pressed, "Do you fear personal accountability?" Laura sniffled, speaking softly. "Yes, but the greater fear is that my child will one day know her mother stayed silent in the face of justice, and I will not let my child grow up with that shame." The image spread like wildfire. Many were outraged, but others called for forgiveness. Public opinion split in two, punishment versus redemption. On Twitter, a post from a 14-year-old boy went viral. "Tomorrow, I will take the train to school. I am black. But today, I believe I have the right to sit anywhere I paid for." More than 2 million likes, over 500,000 shares. Jonathan read the post and smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "That is the real victory." He picked up the phone and called his legal team. "Begin. Plan for the entire nation. We are not just fixing one company. We are going to change the entire rail industry." Beneath the night sky of the Capitol, Jonathan knew he had become not only the chairman of United Railways, but the face of a movement. And that movement had already grown beyond the control of anyone. 3 weeks later, the U.S. Capitol shone under the glare of countless cameras. The halls were packed with reporters, every lens fixed on one name: Jonathan Harris. The man once told he did not belong in first class now entered the hearing room, his stride straight, his eyes sharp. The gavel struck from the chairman's seat. Senator Davis, his hair silver, spoke sternly. "We convene this hearing to clarify one question. Does systemic discrimination exist in the passenger transportation industry?" All eyes turned to Jonathan. He stood, placing his Patek Philippe watch on the table, a symbol of patience carried through his journey. "Honorable Congress," Jonathan began, his deep voice resonating. "The day I sat in seat 1A, I did not sit only as a passenger. I sat as a test, and the result was failure. Not just the failure of United Railways, but our failure when prejudice still has the power to humiliate a human being, no matter who he is." The chamber murmured. Jonathan lifted his tablet, connecting it to the large screen. Clips from the live stream played. Laura's cruel words, Richard's rush to believe them, security closing in, followed by the crowds at Union Station chanting, "Justice on the rails." "This," Jonathan declared, "is the evidence. No one can deny it any longer." A senator pressed, "Mr. Harris, United Railways has pledged change. But what more do you demand?" Jonathan drew a steady breath and proclaimed, "I propose the Harris Protocol, a reform program for the entire industry. Every railway company will be required to implement mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, install transparent surveillance cameras on every train, establish a compensation fund for victims of discrimination, and enforce immediate termination of any employee who violates these standards." Each clause he read ignited waves of murmurs and discussion. Jonathan concluded, no passenger should have to prove their dignity in order to sit in the seat they paid for. A train ticket never comes with a color. Outside the Capitol, thousands had gathered, raising banners high. Emily, the live streamer, now the face of a movement, shouted into a loudspeaker, "No more silence! Justice on the rails!" The roar of the crowd echoed back into the hearing chamber. Laura was there too. She wore a simple white blouse, her eyes weary yet determined. When questioned before the cameras, she spoke with emotion. "I was wrong. I cannot erase my mistake, but I can turn it into a lesson. I will travel and tell this story so that no employee repeats what I did." Some reporters were visibly moved. Others nodded, perhaps believing redemption could begin here. When the hearing ended, Jonathan stepped onto the Capitol steps. Hundreds of microphones pointed toward him. Thousands cheered. He raised his hand, and once again, the crowd fell silent. 3 weeks ago, a seat in 1A became a symbol. Today, an entire industry is changing. But I want you to remember, I did not achieve this alone. It was because of every phone raised, every voice that refused to be silent. Real power does not rest in boardrooms. It rests in the hands of ordinary people who dare to say, "Enough." The chants thundered, rolling like waves that could lift the entire square. Jonathan bowed his head slightly. In the blinding light, he was no longer the man humiliated on a train. He was the flame igniting belief that justice can begin with a single denied seat, but end with an awakened nation. In the world of transportation, a first-class seat may seem like just a place to sit, but Jonathan Harris's story has transformed it into a symbol of dignity and justice. From an expert's perspective, it is clear that the issue was never about an individual mistake, but about a systemic illness, one that has taken root and could only be exposed when the light of truth shined upon it. And most importantly, change does not come from grand speeches, but from the moments when ordinary people dare to speak up, dare to raise their phones, dare to say, "Enough." If you believe that justice is not a privilege but a birthright of every human being, press like to spread this message. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next stories about dignity, prejudice, and change. And I want to hear from you directly. Leave a comment with just 2 words, "justice," to affirm that we all believe in a world where every passenger, every person, deserves respect.